All right, we're just gonna chill and take this real slow. No hype, no drama. Just a long, quiet walk through ancient Rome. Back when it was basically a tiny village by a river and nobody thought it'd be a big deal. So relax, don't overthink it, and let the story roll while Rome slowly figures itself out. Rome didn't start as some legendary empire with marble buildings and gold everywhere. It started rough, broke, and fighting just to survive. Around 753 BCE, the land near the Tiber River was straight-up dangerous territory, full of swamps, wild animals, hostile tribes, and constant beef over land and resources. People weren't dreaming about empire back then, they were worried about food, shelter, and not getting wiped out by the next group that rolled through. The early Romans were farmers, fighters, and survivors, and that survival mindset never really left them, even when they later ruled the world. This place was perfect for defense, close to water, high enough to avoid floods, and central enough to trade, and slowly, without even realizing it, Rome was positioning itself for something bigger. From day one, Rome was built by people who believed that if you didn't push forward, you got crushed. The legend of Romulus and Remus hits different when you really think about it because it sets the tone for everything Rome would become. Two brothers, abandoned, raised by a wolf, fighting over power, and one straight up killing the other to rule alone. That's not a fairy tale, that's a warning. Rome was always about ambition, dominance, and choosing power over peace when forced to decide. Romulus founding Rome after killing his brother basically told the future, because Rome would grow by conquering neighbors, breaking rivals, and absorbing anyone strong enough to be useful. Even the myths were aggressive, sending a message that Rome wasn't built for softness. It was built for control. In its early phase, Rome was ruled by kings, and this era was all about trial and error. Some kings actually helped build Rome, setting up laws, military structure, religion, and basic order that helped people live together instead of constantly fighting each other. Roads were laid down, walls were built, and systems started forming that made Rome feel like more than just a random village. Not all kings were solid leaders. Some abused power, took land, ignored the people, and acted like Rome belonged to them personally. Over time, resentment grew, especially among powerful families who didn't want one man controlling everything. Eventually, the last king crossed the line and Rome snapped. The people revolted, kicked the king out, and swore they would never let a king rule them again. That decision changed history forever. This is where the Roman Republic was born, and on paper it sounded like freedom. No kings, elected officials shared power, laws instead of personal rule. The Senate became the center of politics, packed with elite families who claimed they were protecting the people. But let's keep it real, the Republic mostly protected the rich. Ordinary citizens, known as plebeians, did most of the fighting, farming, and labor, while patricians held power, money, and influence. The system looked balanced, but it wasn't. Over time, regular people got tired of carrying Rome on their backs while having no real voice. Protests broke out, people refused military service, and the state was forced to make reforms just to keep itself from collapsing early. This tension between rich and poor never went away, and it would haunt Rome all the way to the end. Once Rome stabilized internally, it did what it did best: expand. Rome didn't believe in sitting still. If a neighboring group looked weak, Rome pressured them. If negotiations failed, Rome fought. If Rome lost, it learned and came back harder. The Roman military became the backbone of the state, not just fighters but builders, engineers, and organizers. Soldiers built roads as they marched, forts as they rested, and cities where they conquered. Rome didn't just defeat enemies, it absorbed them, offering citizenship, protection, and opportunity in exchange for loyalty. Balanced, but it wasn't. Over time, regular people got tired of carrying Rome on their backs while having no real voice. Protests broke out, people refused military service, and the state was forced to make reforms just to keep itself from collapsing early. This tension between rich and poor never went away, and it would haunt Rome all the way to the end. Once Rome stabilized internally, it did what it did best: expand. Rome didn't believe in sitting still. If a neighboring group looked weak, Rome pressured them. If negotiations failed, Rome fought. If Rome lost, it learned and came back harder. The Roman military became the backbone of the state, not just fighters but builders, engineers, and organizers. Soldiers built roads as they marched, forts as they rested, and cities where they conquered. Rome didn't just defeat enemies, it absorbed them, offering citizenship, protection, and opportunity in exchange for loyalty. This strategy was deadly effective. Over time, Rome controlled all of Italy, and from there it looked outward like the whole Mediterranean was next. The Punic Wars against Carthage were a turning point that almost ended Rome for good. Hannibal was a nightmare for Rome, pulling off moves nobody thought were possible, dragging elephants across mountains and smashing Roman armies on their own land. Rome lost battle after battle, cities panicked, and fear spread. But Rome didn't quit. It refused to surrender, rebuilt its forces, changed tactics, and kept fighting even when defeat seemed guaranteed. Eventually, Rome broke Carthage completely, destroying the city and erasing it from power. That victory sent a message to the world. Rome might bleed, but it doesn't stay down. With victory came wealth, and with wealth came problems. Slaves flooded into Rome, farms turned into massive estates, farmers were pushed out. Cities became overcrowded, jobs disappeared, and the gap between rich and poor exploded. Politics turned violent, corruption became normal, and generals gained more loyalty from soldiers than the Republic itself. Rome was winning everywhere except at home. This is where the system started cracking because power was no longer balanced, it was concentrated. Julius Caesar didn't create Rome's problems, but he knew how to use them. He was a master politician, general, and strategist who understood people better than the Senate ever did. When he crossed the Rubicon, he knew there was no going back. Civil war followed, blood spilled, and Caesar came out on top. He pushed reforms, helped the poor, and centralized power, but that scared the elite. They didn't kill Caesar to save democracy. They killed him to save their control. Ironically, that assassination killed the Republic instead. Rome exploded into chaos after Caesar's death, with betrayals, power struggles, and nonstop violence. Eventually, Octavian played the game smarter than everyone else and emerged as Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The Republic was dead, even if people pretended otherwise. Under Augustus, Rome entered the Pax Romana, a long stretch of peace where roads expanded, trade exploded, cities grew, and Rome hit its peak. But the seeds of decline were already planted. And this is only the beginning. All right, let's roll straight into part 2. No recap, no restart. Picking up right where we left off. Keeping the same American slang, long paragraphs, slow pacing, documentary energy, because this is how you actually build a 10,000 word Roman story that holds attention. After Augustus locked in power and ended the chaos, Rome finally got a breather, and that era became known as the Pax Romana, which basically means Roman peace. But don't get it twisted. This peace wasn't soft or gentle, it was enforced peace, the kind where rebellion got crushed fast and order was maintained through discipline, structure, and fear of consequences. Augustus understood something earlier leaders didn't. People don't just want freedom, they want stability, food, jobs, and the feeling that tomorrow won't be worse than today. So he focused on building systems that made daily life smoother while quietly holding all real power in his own hands. He fixed taxes, reformed the army, paid soldiers regularly so they stayed loyal to the state instead of random generals, and promoted Roman values like family, duty, and tradition to make people feel like Rome was strong again. Daily life during this time was busy, loud, and nonstop, especially in big cities like Rome itself, where over 1 million people were packed into a place with narrow streets, tall apartment buildings, and constant movement. The city never slept. Markets were always active. Vendors were yelling prices. Carts were rolling through. Animals were everywhere. And people from all over the empire mixed together, speaking different languages and wearing different clothes. Public baths were the real social hubs, not just places to clean up, but spots where people talked politics, business, gossip, and sports, because in Rome, being clean was important, but being connected was even more important. For poor citizens, life was still hard: cramped apartments, fire risks, food shortages, and dependence on free grain from the government. But compared to earlier chaos, things felt predictable, and that alone earned Augustus loyalty. Rome's infrastructure during this period was next level for the ancient world, and honestly, that's one of the biggest reasons the empire lasted so long. Roads stretched across continents, built strong enough that some of them still exist today, allowing armies, messengers, and traders to move fast. Aqueducts carried fresh water into cities from miles away, feeding fountains, baths, and homes, from turning into a complete disaster. Rome didn't just conquer land, it organized it, dividing provinces, appointing governors, collecting taxes, and spreading Roman law everywhere it went. Even people who hated Roman rule had to admit that Rome brought order, and in a chaotic ancient world, order was powerful. But while the surface looked strong, cracks were forming underneath, because the empire was now fully dependent on one man at the top. When emperors were competent, Rome thrived, but when they were unstable, cruel, or disconnected, everything suffered. After Augustus, some emperors held the line, but others were straight-up disasters. Caligula turned power into madness, Nero turned leadership into performance, and fear became a tool of control. When emperors ruled by paranoia, executions increased, trust collapsed, and people started realizing that absolute power was dangerous no matter how impressive the empire looked from the outside. The Roman army remained powerful, but it was expensive, massive, and constantly needed funding. Soldiers were stationed far from home, guarding borders in freezing forests, burning deserts, and distant mountains, sometimes for decades. Over time, recruitment shifted, pulling more soldiers from, which slowly changed the whole vibe of the Roman army, because these new soldiers didn't grow up hearing Rome's old stories, myths, and values the same way earlier generations did. They weren't fighting because Rome was their homeland or because they believed in the Republic or the Empire. They were fighting because it paid, because it gave them food, status, and a shot at a better life. And honestly, you can't blame them, but that shift mattered because loyalty started following money and commanders instead of the idea of Rome itself. Generals who knew how to promise land, bonuses, and protection could turn entire legions into personal power bases, which meant emperors were, no matter how strong their title sounded. Every ruler had to watch their back, not just from foreign enemies, but from their own army, and that kind of pressure creates paranoia, bad decisions, and constant instability. At the same time, the Roman economy was feeling the weight of centuries of expansion, because the system was built on conquest, and once expansion slowed, the money flow slowed too. Fewer wars meant fewer slaves, less loot, and less fresh land to hand out to soldiers, which caused frustration inside the ranks and stress on the government. Coins started losing value, inflation hit regular people hard, taxes went up, and small businesses struggled to survive while elites found ways to protect their wealth. Cities that once felt alive and crowded started shrinking, public buildings fell into disrepair, and people focused more on local survival than loyalty to a distant empire that no longer felt powerful or protective. As borders weakened, more groups pushed into Roman territory, not always as invaders, but as migrants looking for safety from wars, famine, and pressure from other tribes. Rome tried to manage this by settling them inside the empire, turning former enemies into farmers and soldiers, but the system was already strained, and poor management turned potential solutions into new problems. Local Roman populations felt ignored, resentment grew, and trust in central authority kept fading. Rome was still massive on paper, but in real life it was becoming fragmented, uneven, and fragile, with different regions experiencing completely different versions of what Rome even meant anymore. Rome is still standing, still powerful on paper, but you can feel the ground shaking under its feet because the problems aren't outside anymore, they're inside the system itself. By this point in history, Rome wasn't losing because it forgot how to fight. It was losing because it forgot how to manage success. The empire had grown so big that running it felt less like leadership and more like damage, and every decision came with consequences nobody could fully predict. Emperors rose fast and fell even faster, some lasting years, others barely surviving months, and that constant turnover wrecked stability. When leadership changes nonstop, laws don't stick, reforms don't last, and people stop believing anything is permanent. This era, often called the crisis of the 3rd century, was pure chaos, like Rome hit a stretch of nonstop bad luck mixed with terrible decisions. Emperors were getting assassinated left and right, sometimes by rivals, sometimes by their own soldiers, sometimes just because the army wanted someone else who promised better pay. Imagine living in a world where the most powerful man alive could be dead by tomorrow, replaced by someone completely different with a totally new agenda. That kind of uncertainty kills trust fast. Provinces started acting more independently, generals stopped waiting for approval, and loyalty became temporary, transactional, and fragile. Rome wasn't united anymore, it was just connected by habit and fear. The economy took a serious hit during this time, and not in some abstract way, but in everyday life. Money lost value so badly that people stopped trusting coins, trade slowed down, prices jumped, and basic goods became harder to afford. Farmers abandoned land because taxes were crushing, cities shrank because people moved closer to food sources, and the middle class, what little of it existed, started disappearing. When regular people feel like the system only takes and never gives back, they mentally check out, and that's exactly what happened across large parts of the empire. Rome still demanded loyalty, taxes, and service, but it stopped delivering security in return. To survive, emperors started making hard, sometimes desperate moves. The army was reorganized, borders were reinforced, and power was centralized even more. But that also made emperors more isolated and more paranoid. Diocletian tried to fix the mess by splitting all rulers, basically saying the empire was too big for one man to handle alone. On paper, it made sense, but in reality, it added complexity, rivalries, and confusion. People didn't always know who was really in charge, and that uncertainty filtered down into every level of government. Rome was trying to fix cracks by adding more structure, but sometimes more structure just hides problems instead of solving them. Then came Constantine, one of the most important figures in Roman history, not because he conquered massive new lands, but because he changed what Rome stood for. By legalizing Christianity and later supporting it, Constantine reshaped the empire's identity at its core. This wasn't just a religious change, it was cultural, political, and emotional. Loyalty slowly shifted from the old Roman gods and traditions to a new belief system that promised meaning beyond the state. For a lot of people, especially those struggling, Christianity offered hope when Rome no longer could. But this shift also weakened the old glue that once held the empire together, replacing shared civic duty with personal faith. At the same time, the empire officially split into eastern and western halves, and from this point on, their paths looked very different. The Eastern Empire was richer, more urban, and better positioned to adapt, with strong cities, trade networks, and leadership. The Western Empire, on the other hand, was mostly rural, economically weaker, and constantly under pressure. Invasions hit the West harder, not always because the invaders were stronger, but because the West didn't have the resources or organization to respond effectively. Armies were smaller, funding was weaker, and coordination broke down fast. What really hurt the Western Empire wasn't just outside pressure, but the loss of belief. People stopped thinking of Rome as something eternal. It became distant, unreliable, and abstract. Local leaders mattered more than emperors. Survival rulers, basically saying the empire was too big for one man to handle alone. On paper, it made sense, but in reality, it added complexity, rivalries, and confusion. People didn't always know who was really in charge, and that uncertainty filtered down into every level of government. Rome was trying to fix cracks by adding more structure, but sometimes more structure just hides problems instead of solving them. Then came Constantine, one of the most important figures in Roman history, not because he conquered massive new lands, but because he changed what Rome stood for. By legalizing Christianity and later supporting it, Constantine reshaped the empire's identity at its core. This wasn't just a religious change, it was cultural, political, and emotional. Loyalty slowly shifted from the old Roman gods and traditions to a new belief system that promised meaning beyond the state. For a lot of people, especially those struggling, Christianity offered hope when Rome no longer could. But this shift also weakened the old glue that once held the empire together, replacing shared civic duty with personal faith. At the same time, the empire officially split into eastern and western halves, and from this point on, their paths looked very different. The Eastern Empire was richer, more urban, and better positioned to adapt, with strong cities, trade networks, and leadership. The Western Empire, on the other hand, was mostly rural, economically weaker, and constantly under pressure. Invasions hit the West harder, not always because the invaders were stronger, but because the West didn't have the resources or organization to respond effectively. Armies were smaller, funding was weaker, and coordination broke down fast. What really hurt the Western Empire wasn't just outside pressure, but the loss of belief. People stopped thinking of Rome as something eternal. It became distant, unreliable, and abstract. Local leaders mattered more than emperors. Survival. Rome built gets tested by time, pressure, and reality. By now, the Western Roman Empire was basically running on fumes, surviving more on habit than strength, and everyone could feel it. From senators in half-empty halls to farmers watching roads crumble and soldiers waiting months for pay that never showed up. The government still existed, titles were still used, laws were still written, but authority felt hollow, like a badge without power behind it. Emperors came and went so fast that people stopped memorizing their names, because why bother learning about a ruler who might be gone next season? Real control shifted to generals, local strongmen, and regional leaders who could actually protect people day to day. When outside groups moved deeper into Roman territory, it wasn't always with fire and sword swinging. A lot of the time, it was negotiation, settlement, and quiet takeover. These groups respected Rome's reputation, wanted its land, and even wanted its approval, but Rome no longer had the leverage to fully control the situation. So deals were made, land was handed over, and former enemies became semi-allies who followed Roman law when it suited them and ignored it when it didn't. This blurred the line between Roman and non-Roman even more, until the idea of a clear Roman identity in the West almost disappeared. The empire still existed in name, but in practice, it had fractured into overlapping zones of power. In 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor was removed, it barely caused a ripple. No massive final battle, no dramatic collapse scene, just a quiet moment where authority changed hands. For most people, life didn't suddenly flip overnight. They still farmed, traded, worshipped, and survived like they had the day before, just under different leadership. That's the part people don't always get. Rome didn't fall like a building collapsing. It faded like a shadow at sunset. The system had already stopped working long before the official end date showed up in history books. While the West struggled and dissolved, the Eastern Roman Empire was doing something completely different. It adapted. Centered around Constantinople, the East had stronger cities, better trade routes, and more stable leadership. It held on to Roman law, administration, and identity, even while changing language and culture over time. This empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, saw itself as the real Rome, not a successor, but the continuation. Emperors still called themselves Roman, laws were still Roman, and the idea of Rome stayed alive for centuries longer than most people realize. One of the most important Eastern emperors, Justinian, tried to bring the old glory back, pushing military campaigns to reclaim Western lands while also reforming Roman law into a clean, organized system that would influence legal thinking for centuries. His ambition was massive, and for a moment, it looked like Rome might reunite, but reality pushed back hard. Wars drained resources, plagues hit cities, and reconquest proved too expensive to maintain. Still, Justinian's legal reforms survived, becoming one of Rome's strongest long-term legacies. Christianity fully reshaped Rome's role in the world during this period. What started as a persecuted belief ended up becoming one of the empire's most powerful unifying forces, especially in the East. Churches replaced temples, bishops gained influence, and religious authority sometimes rivaled political power. Rome no longer defined itself by conquest alone, but by faith, tradition, and continuity. This shift helped preserve Roman ideas even after Roman armies stopped dominating the map. In the West, Roman influence didn't disappear, it blended. New kingdoms borrowed Roman laws, titles, architecture, and administration because they worked. It looked like Rome might reunite, but reality pushed back hard. Wars drained resources, plagues hit cities, and reconquest proved too expensive to maintain. Still, Justinian's legal reforms survived, becoming one of Rome's strongest long-term legacies. Christianity fully reshaped Rome's role in the world during this period. What started as a persecuted belief ended up becoming one of the empire's most powerful unifying forces, especially in the East. Churches replaced temples, bishops gained influence, and religious authority sometimes rivaled political power. Rome no longer defined itself by conquest alone, but by faith, tradition, and continuity. This shift helped preserve Roman ideas even after Roman armies stopped dominating the map. In the West, Roman influence didn't disappear, it blended. New kingdoms borrowed Roman laws, titles, architecture, and administration because they worked. Latin evolved into new languages. Roman roads stayed in use, and Roman cities became centers of medieval life. Even the idea of empire itself, of one power ruling many peoples under one system, came straight from Rome. Every ruler who called himself emperor afterward was chasing Rome's shadow, trying to claim legitimacy by linking themselves to its past. Rome's real ending wasn't about defeat, it was about transformation. The empire changed shape, identity, and structure, but its core ideas refused to die. Law, citizenship, governance, engineering, and culture all carried Roman fingerprints. Rome taught the world how to organize power on a massive scale, and it also showed what happens when that power grows too complex to manage. That's why Rome still matters, not as a dead empire, but as a living lesson. This is the point where Rome stops being just ancient history and starts being a warning, a blueprint, how ambition builds greatness, how systems grow heavy under their own success, and how adaptability decides survival. Rome ruled the world, lost control of it, and still shaped everything that came after. That's not failure, that's influence. Rome stops being an empire on a map and turns into an idea that just refuses to die. This is the part people rush, but honestly it's the most important because it explains why Rome still lives rent-free in the modern world. After the West faded and the East carried on, Roman identity didn't disappear, it just changed clothes. People stopped calling themselves citizens of an empire and started calling themselves subjects of kings, but the systems underneath were still Roman. Courts still used Roman-style laws, cities still followed Roman layouts, taxes still moved through Roman-style bureaucracy, and even when rulers didn't fully understand what they inherited, they knew it worked well enough to keep. Roman law became one of the biggest long-term power moves in human history, because instead of ruling purely by tradition or religion, Rome wrote things down, defined rights, defined responsibilities, and built legal logic that could be reused over and over again. Centuries later, European kingdoms, universities, and eventually modern nations would dig up Roman legal texts and realize, yeah, this still makes sense. Concepts like contracts, citizenship, property rights, and legal procedure all trace back to Roman thinking, which means every time a modern court makes a decision, Rome is quietly in the room. That's wild influence for a civilization that supposedly fell. Language is another place where Rome never left. Latin didn't just vanish, it evolved, splitting into new languages like Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, while also shaping English through law, science, religion, and government terms. Words like Senate, Republic, Justice, Constitution, and Empire all come straight from Rome, meaning every single day without even realizing it. When a culture's language survives, its mindset usually survives too, and Rome locked that in for good. Roman engineering stayed undefeated for a long time. Roads laid down by Roman soldiers and engineers kept trade moving for centuries after the empire faded, because they were built to last, not just to look good. Aqueducts inspired future water systems, arches shaped architecture, and concrete formulas were so advanced that modern engineers are still studying how Romans pulled it off. Medieval cities reused Roman buildings, lived inside Roman walls, and relied on Roman infrastructure like it was inherited hardware nobody could afford to replace. Rome didn't just build for its own time, it built for the future. Politically, Rome became the ultimate reference point. Any ruler who wanted legitimacy looked backward and tried to connect themselves to Rome. Medieval emperors called themselves Caesars, kings claimed Roman ancestry, and even the Catholic Church modeled its organization on Roman administration. The idea of a republic with elected officials, checks on power, and civic duty came straight out of Roman experiments, flaws and all. Modern democracies study Rome not because it was perfect, but because it shows what works, what breaks, and what happens when ambition outpaces accountability. Culturally, Rome left behind a warning label as much as a blueprint. It showed how expansion brings wealth, how wealth brings inequality, how inequality brings unrest, and how unrest eventually breaks systems if leadership doesn't adapt. Rome didn't collapse because people got lazy, it collapsed because its systems became too complex, too rigid, and too disconnected from everyday reality. That lesson hits hard in every era, especially for powerful nations that think they're immune to history. What makes Rome special isn't just that it ruled so much land, it's that it ruled for so long and still managed to influence the world after losing everything. Most palaces were all designed to echo Roman power, like rulers were saying, "This isn't something new. This is Rome continuing through me." That's how strong the Roman brand was. Even a broken empire could still dominate minds. The Catholic Church became one of the biggest carriers of Roman structure. Its hierarchy, administration, record-keeping, and territorial organization were straight out of Roman governance playbooks. Bishops acted like provincial governors. Rome stayed a spiritual capital, and Latin remained the language of power and learning for centuries. Even when armies failed, Roman organization survived through religion, quietly shaping Europe while kingdoms rose and fell around it. That's a crazy kind of endurance. Militarily, Rome set the standard for discipline, structure, and logistics. Later armies studied Roman tactics, formations, and command systems, trying to recreate that balance of flexibility and control. The idea that an army isn't just fighters but planners, engineers, medics, and supply managers came straight from Roman practice. Even modern military thinking still respects that Roman lesson. Battles are won long before swords ever clash. Politically, Rome became the ultimate case study. Every republic, every empire, every superpower ends up asking the same question Rome answered and then failed to keep answering. How do you balance power so the system survives longer than the people running it? Rome tried kings, then a republic, then emperors, and each system worked until it didn't. That's why modern governments still study Rome, not to copy it exactly, but to understand where things break under pressure. Culturally, Rome shaped what the West even considers normal. Urban life, public spaces, citizenship, written law, civic duty, and even the idea that the state should provide infrastructure all trace back to Roman expectations. When modern people complain about roads, taxes,